And I think, as you mentioned in one example here, right, the officer who was trying not to have his the Notre Dame ring removed, that Japanese officer who graduated from Southern California, he literally beat up the Japanese soldier who was taking the ring away from the
Yep.
American. So
It
I think that's just
was
an example
yeah.
of an officer beating up the soldier.
It was systemic, the violence against their troops, like physically the beatings. There's also a culture of not respecting an adversary that surrendered. They saw it as disgusting, so they had cultural things that kind of like enforce the idea that these people should not be treated well. In the episode, if people are interested, in a week or two, it'll come out on the Pacific War Week by Week podcast. I have basically 10 categories I go through as to why the Japanese did what they did. So you can listen to it there. It's tries to explain it in a very thorough manner because it's a very complex situation. It has to deal with a very a bastardized version of Bushido, a culture that promotes suicide and not surrender for that matter, and violence amongst the troops against each other. There's a lot of factors. So, yeah. Corpses lined the
It's
ditches along the sides. Oh,
just
yeah.
funny that they try to take inspiration from, like, the Shogun era, Sengoku
Yeah, I
Jidai
know.
kind of. But a lot of those guys were willing to actually surrender for the safety of their men, as long as they just committed seppuku and such. So it was really like the top command that would get got it. Now it's just everyone gets got it.
Yeah, exactly. So corpses lined the ditches along the sides of the roads, with crows tearing into them amidst clouds of flies. Lieutenant Colonel Alan Stowell began counting the corpses, reaching 27 before he chided to himself, "You've got to cut this out." And then he resumed marching with his gaze fixed straight ahead. A young Filipino, Lieutenant Tony Aquino, who had actually swum to Corregidor to see President Quezon, had been walking without rest or water, and he had lost about 50 pounds since arriving in Bataan. His legs were swollen, and when an American crumpled before him, a Japanese guard began to kick the man until he struggled painfully to rise, extending his hand in a plea for help. The Japanese officer stabbed him with his bayonet right through the man's neck, then pushed his body right into a ditch, as Aquino watched helplessly. Further back, General Blummel marched alongside Brigadier General Luther Stevens when a Japanese soldier in a passing truck swung a bamboo pole viciously at Stevens' head. Blummel caught his staggering colleague as the two fell towards a ditch. A guard pointed a revolver at Blummel, motioning for him to march on, but Blummel ignored the order, helping a dazed Stevens to his feet. Yet Stevens' legs buckled, and he fell into the middle of a rice paddy. Another guard then rushed at them with a fixed bayonet, assuming that they were trying to flee. But when he saw Stevens face down the rice paddy, he presumed he was dead, and he gestured for Blummel to continue. Stevens then crawled behind some underbrush, and he watched as the column moved onwards. So had it not been for Blummel's bravery, he would have been killed. Unfortunately, another Japanese unit would later discover him and take him back as a prisoner, so he did not escape. At a rest stop a few miles north, Corporal Roy Castleberry witnessed two civilians digging a hole and placing a delirious American captain into it. When the captain realized what was happening, he desperately struggled to try and escape what was being his grave, prompting a guard to order the Filipinos to hit the man over the head with their shovels. They initially refused until the Japanese raised his rifles at them. With contorted faces in anguish, they struck the captain over the head with their shovels, and they buried him alive. Castleberry saw a hand feebly clawing out of the dirt of that grave. And that image apparently haunted him for the rest of his life.
Can't
Yeah,
blame him, man. It's
it's rough.
costly.
Many prisoners who fell were just shot or bayoneted. Some Japanese officers on horseback beheaded prisoners with their katanas. As prisoners made their way to Lubao, they encountered a particularly brutal stretch of unshaded road. Thirst became unbearable, and many prisoners risked their lives trying to sneak into sugarcane fields to get, a drop of moisture. Most men were so dehydrated they could no longer urinate, and those who could reported it was like pissing hot iron. At Lubao, a city of about 30,000 residents at the time, people lined the streets trying to toss food like hard-boiled eggs, fried chicken wrapped in banana leaves, and pieces of panachao to the men, alongside hard brown sugar. And the Japanese guards held the crowds of civilians back with their rifles, but occasionally an elderly Filipino woman would grab a prisoner, pull him out of the column, standing over him with her long skirt to try and protect him. At the far edge of the town, the Japanese began herding the front line of prisoners into large tin roofed rice mills, packing several thousand men inside. There was only a single water spigot, and any minor act of insubordination could result in the prisoners being slashed with sabers or bayonets. Some were beaten to death without any reason at all given to it. The final stretch to San Fernando was about 9 miles, and it was brutal. The asphalt roads, churned by tanks and trucks, felt like molten lava under the sun.
I'm sorry, as if the rest of the march wasn't brutal by any standard.
Yeah. A lot of these guys are barefoot, by the way, so you can only imagine the soles of their feet are just in agony. As the starving, dehydrated men passed lines of trucks, it felt like a gauntlet, with soldiers in the vehicles swinging the rifle butts and bamboo poles to hit the Filipinos and the Americans. In town, civilians came from all over Luzon in search of their loved ones, weeping when they saw the skeletal army that was marching. And here, at least some of the aspects of Kwane's plan were executed with a semblance of efficiency. The prisoners received rice balls, water, and medical treatment here. They were confined in makeshift locations like dance halls, poetry sheds, empty lots, schools, and old factories and such. Lieutenant Aquino's group was locked inside of a rundown vinegar factory where he collapsed unconscious for over 14 hours. Upon waking, he was escorted by some Japanese to Japanese barracks, where his father was with a Japanese colonel. His father embraced him. Mr. Aquino is a good friend of Japan, said a Kempeitai commander with a British accent, before telling Aquino that he could go home. However, Aquino refused to abandon his men, and he instead requested more food and medicine for the prisoners. Your father was right. He said you would refuse. Please accept my apologies for the treatment that you have all endured, was what the Kempeitai officer said. Aquino was allowed to spend some time with his father, who informed him that President Quezon was trying to secure earlier releases for the Filipinos being sent to the prison camps. He said, "Hurry, Papa, we're dying like flies." The men were then crammed into boxcars with over 100 or so per car. Soon the vehicles were filled with vomit, feces, and urine. The stench became unbearable, according to Staff Sergeant Alf Larson. The train consisted of 6 or 7 World War I era boxcars. They packed us in the cars like sardines. So tight you couldn't sit down. Then they shut the door. If you passed out, they couldn't fall down. If someone had to go to the toilet, you went right there where you were. It was close to summer, and the weather had hot and humid temperatures, hotter than Billy Blazes. We were on the train from early in the morning to late in the afternoon without getting out. People died in the railroad cars. From there was a 3-hour trip to Capas, and many men would perish along the way. Some guards opened the locked doors, while others just kept them closed, preventing fresh air from entering. Filipinos frequently approached, handing over water bottles, tomatoes, bananas, rice, and other items. Many Americans who had previously held racial biases towards Filipinos began to really appreciate their courage and humanity. At Capas,
It's actually just really call that out, the courage of the civilian population for even attempting this, even at the town of, Lubao, where, like they'll try to get a prisoner right under that old woman's long skirt, because if they are caught, their family is history.
yeah, because they're going to be occupied, and it's a brutal occupation to be sure. At Capas, the trains were unloaded, and the prisoners faced an additional 8-mile trek by foot over sun-baked and dusty roads to Camp O'Donnell. Upon arrival, they were herded through the gates, flanked by towers manned by machine gun nests. They were forced to sit for hours under the sun before an officer, the camp commander, strode out. He faced them, and he announced in a belligerent tone, through an interpreter, that the U.S. was his greatest enemy, and that the Japanese would defeat the Americans even if it took 100 years.